Welcome, friends, enemies, and everyone in between, to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am, in fact, The Masked Mormon.
Why you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
If you are returning, welcome back. If this is your first time here, I am a Mormon who used to believe in the truth claims of the Mormon Church. I did it all. I was baptized, I went on a mission, I attended BYU, I went through the temple, was married in the temple, and all the rest of it. I truly believed in the claims of Mormonism. Now, I explore some of the implications of Mormon theology, culture, and some of my own personal experiences, and talk about it on the internet with you fine viewers. It has been a lot of fun seeing this channel slowly start to grow over the last couple of years. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. It really does help this channel gain more visibility. I recently made a video talking about what I feel should be the most important part of the Book of Mormon. If you haven't seen it yet, please go check it out. To make a long story short, the most important part of the Book of Mormon occurs just after Jesus' alleged visit to the Americas and the era of utopia. If it were real, knowing how to set up and administer such utopia would be one of the most important records on governance in human history. Well, I received an interesting comment on that video. It comes from user Barton Banges 4605. Barton, if you're watching, this video is in response to your comment. Barton says that, quote, if you want a description of what an era of peace looks like in more detail, then all you have to do is study Quetzalcoatl, the white bearded god of the Maya. You must be a very lazy learner not to have already done this, end quote. Now, with comments, I always try to err on the side that commenters are sincere and I recognize their humanity. And I generally try to assume that if anything comes across as negative, it's due to the limited nature of text responses. Perhaps a comment is meant with a certain amount of sarcasm or good-natured ribbing. So, when it's suggested that I'm a lazy learner, I took it as a good-natured ribbing, because if you're familiar with my videos, I certainly hope I don't come across as a lazy learner. There is a lot of possible content that I purposefully leave out of my videos, because this isn't a history channel, and I don't want to bore you too much with my deep, rumbly voice. So, assuming the lazy learner indictment was good-natured, I responded in a light manner. I said, quote, for a while, I thought that the folklore around Quetzalcoatl was a slam dunk for supporting the historical claims of the Book of Mormon. Then, like most things around Book of Mormon truth claims, it fell apart upon examination. To which Barton then responded, quote, I find the case gets stronger and stronger the more I learn of Quetzalcoatl, especially with all of the other accounts of the Pale Prophet recorded in legends all over the Americas and Pacific Islands, healing and giving laws and bring a time of peace. They don't all include small details, but the details I mentioned are standard. Sorry, your research is so incomplete. But when all you are doing is looking for excuses for you to sin, why would you keep looking past the surface? End quote. Oh, so you're serious. I'm not only a lazy learner, but I'm looking for excuses to sin. So I guess what you're saying is that I'm using motivated reasoning to ignore evidence that should be very evident if I just look past the surface. Okay, challenge accepted. Let's examine the claims that the Nahua god, Quetzalcoatl, and Jesus are one and the same. Let's first delve into the mythology of Quetzalcoatl, which is the correct pronunciation of this mythological deity. The Nahua are indigenous people of Mexico, and they founded the Toltec and Aztec empires. From here on out, I'll just refer to them as the Aztecs. Quetzalcoatl was the Aztec version of the feathered serpent god and had been worshipped by several groups over the centuries, including the Maya. In fact, the name means feathered serpent. Quetzalcoatl originated as a vegetarian god, but his role in Aztec mythology changed over time. The feathered serpent deity was common to much of Central America, first appearing in images and carvings starting around 100 BC in the Olmec civilization. Credited as the mother of civilization in Mesoamerica, the Olmec spread their culture throughout the region, including their belief in the plumed serpent. Around 1200 AD, Quetzalcoatl began to be portrayed as a man, wearing a conical hat and a red duck-billed face mask. Maybe I'd be in good company. Mythologically speaking, Quetzalcoatl was the third son of the creator god. He was born of a virgin goddess who conceived when she swallowed an emerald. Other stories have her conceiving when she was impregnated by another god who shot an arrow into her abdomen. One of his notable siblings, who he was often in conflict with, was the jaguar god, Tezcatlipoca. Now, I have to admit that that's kind of a lot of fun to say. Tezcatlipoca. Quetzalcoatl's role in Aztec cosmology was complex, but it was his brother, Tezcatlipoca, who ultimately ruled. Quetzalcoatl was sometimes portrayed as a trickster god, kind of like Loki in Norse mythology. Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca were responsible for the creation of the cosmos. After creating fire, they molded a partial sun and gave life to the first man and woman. Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca often worked in opposition to each other and were rivals. This rivalry was a recurring theme in Aztec mythology, with the flying serpent frequently pitted against the black jaguar. Each bout of fighting brought on a new era of Aztec history, with Tezcatlipoca in control of their then modern age. Quetzalcoatl was instrumental in creating people to populate that era. To do this, Quetzalcoatl snuck into the underworld to trick the Lord and Lady of Death into giving him the bones that they guarded. After some subterfuge and trickery, the Lord and Lady of Death gave Quetzalcoatl the bones. Quetzalcoatl eventually escaped the underworld and inadvertently jumbled up the bones he stole. He then mixed the bones with his blood and with corn to create humans. In another tale, the Aztec people only had access to roots and wild game. At the time, maize, what we would call corn, was located on the other side of a mountain range that surrounded the Aztec homeland. Other gods had attempted to retrieve maize by moving the mountains, but they ultimately failed. Quetzalcoatl used his mind instead of brute force to solve the problem. He turned himself into a black ant and followed the other ants over the mountains. After a long journey, a la Lord of the Rings, Quetzalcoatl reached the maize and brought a kernel back to the Aztec people. Some stories say that Quetzalcoatl had a twin brother, the dog-headed deity of night. He was linked with death, disease, and deformity. This twin brother would guide the recently deceased souls to the underworld. There are, of course, other stories about the exploits of the deity Quetzalcoatl, but this isn't really the forum for all of those. He was also credited with the creation of the calendar, with science, with art, learning, and is associated with rain and the planet Venus. The worship of Quetzalcoatl involved animal sacrifices, specifically butterflies and hummingbirds. Though stories say that the worship of Quetzalcoatl did not include human sacrifice, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of bodies buried under a temple dedicated to this god. Quetzalcoatl appeared in many forms. Of course, in the non-human form, he appeared as a feathered serpent. He also sometimes appears in human form, wearing a red and black mask, like I mentioned, and sometimes a toga-like garment. There's also another mythical figure who may have some basis in history. There was a ruler of the city of Tolan by the name of Tapilzin Quetzalcoatl. He was famous for his wise rule. Under his guidance, the city of Tolan became incredibly prosperous. And under his rule, the people rejected the practice of human sacrifice. While many were happy, Tezcatlipoca plotted to bring him down. One night, Tezcatlipoca gifted Quetzalcoatl a special drink made of agave. Is that tequila? Quetzalcoatl didn't know that the drink was intoxicating, as such a thing had yet to be discovered. Quetzalcoatl became drunk, and being filled with carnal desires, slept with a priestess, possibly his own daughter, in the temple. When he awoke, he was ashamed and felt unclean. He felt he was no longer worthy to lead the city. And what happens next varies depending on the version of the story. Some say that Quetzalcoatl cremated himself. Others say that he spent 8 days in the underworld before emerging as Venus, the morning star. Others say that he built a boat out of snakes and sailed out to sea, apparently promising to return one day. So, with some of these stories, you could see how there could be a bit of a connection with Jesus. But how did Quetzalcoatl start to be associated with Jesus? The identification of Quetzalcoatl with Christ, or any other non-Indian figure, depends on a series of traits that appear in native sources. Quetzalcoatl was said to have been benevolent, a lawgiver who provided a moral basis for society. Some descriptions portray this god as a white, bearded man wearing a long white robe, also promising to return one day to rule again. That seems like a shoo-in, right? Obviously, Jesus at some point visited the people of America and taught them the gospel, right? While all of those traits have roots in the native legends, each one has been altered by pressures of the Spanish conquest. The most striking aspects of these traits, those suggesting that the legends referred to the appearance of Christ, are all Spanish elaborations on native legends. The original tales do not support the identification of Quetzalcoatl with any foreign visitor any more than the tales of Greek mythology describe Jesus. Information and stories about Quetzalcoatl were successively shaped until the native deity appeared as a shadow behind a Christian curtain. The Christianizing process was no accident. There were influences at work that predisposed the Spanish to see biblical influences in the customs of the indigenous people. As the conquest was occurring in the New World, there was controversy in Spain over the proper relationship between Spain and the indigenous. If the Indians were seen as non-human, they could be exploited. But if they were human, there was an obligation to treat them as such. Priests were often the most vocal advocates for the Indian cause, often drawing parallels between biblical religion and the native customs, speculating that the Indians had once been true believers, but had fallen from grace. There was competing messaging. Anti-Indian writers would focus only on the idolatry and sacrifices made in gods like Quetzalcoatl's honor. Pro-Indian authors had a vested interest in a Christianized native. These people would focus on the legends that mention Quetzalcoatl as a cultural hero. They had an underlying motivation that colored the tales of Quetzalcoatl. Ultimately, the changes these influencers introduced into the tales changed the original myth so much that a new deity was created, and a new tale was begun. The drive to Christianize Quetzalcoatl was evident in the alterations in his clothing. Quetzalcoatl is usually described as wearing a white robe that reaches his ankles. This is indeed quite different than what is usually imagined native people wearing. Native dress could include a cape-like garment, which was a piece of cloth worn under the right arm and tied in a knot over the left shoulder. Most commonly, it would reach down to just below the shin. However, longer lengths were worn for those with higher social standing, with the most important men wearing one that reached their ankles. A god like Quetzalcoatl would clearly qualify for that privilege. When the word for this garment entered Spanish literature, it was labeled as a robe. From that point on, the connection to the native garment was lost. Once the description was in Spanish, the connotation of the garment followed Spanish rather than Aztec norms. As the conquest continued and the Spanish exploited the people, and as disease and death ran rampant through native populations, it became politically expedient and pragmatic for the native people themselves to relate their own religious practices to Christianity. They had to play the same game. The Christianizing process became a two-way street, where not only were the Spanish reshaping native legends into Christian ones, but the natives adopted Christianity into their own legends and fed them back to the Spanish. It was a survival tactic, where the Spanish would see some of the tales of Quetzalcoatl paralleling the Exodus story or different New Testament episodes. The Aztecs would purposefully draw parallels with the Christian stories to tell back to the Spanish. The benevolent nature of Quetzalcoatl's religion was transformed as much by the Aztecs as by the Spanish. These were people that were knowledgeable in their own culture and their own myths, but also well schooled by the Spanish in Catholicism. The Spanish were especially strident on the concept of a one and only God, obliterating the idols. Impressing Spanish culture pressed home the importance of various Christian principles. Let's take human sacrifice, for example. A lot of post-conquest stories about Quetzalcoatl describe him as despising human sacrifice. Though not explicitly stated in the stories, in temples dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, archaeologists have discovered bodies of sacrificed people who had their chests opened up, presumably to remove their hearts. So what gives? Was Quetzalcoatl into human sacrifice or not? Well, the native legends were consciously shaped by the Aztecs to improve their standing with the Spanish invaders. This influence took the form of Christianizing the religion of Quetzalcoatl. But what about Quetzalcoatl being described in some stories as a white bearded man? Well, the idol of the god was always painted black. And, like many of the other stories being morphed by the Spanish, and sometimes the Aztecs themselves, the same thing happened here. There was a misunderstanding about the context these stories were told in. The Spanish didn't understand the cultural milieu of the Aztecs, so they may have read some stories or heard them told and heard about a white god, but not understanding that certain colors represented certain things to the Aztecs. For instance, Quetzalcoatl was associated with the West, which was apparently symbolized by the Aztecs with the color white. The other compass directions were represented by other colors like red, blue, and black. Thus, when Quetzalcoatl is described as white, it is an indication of the cardinal direction west. Even the claim that when Cortez landed, the Aztecs interpreted a white man as a return of Quetzalcoatl isn't borne by any contemporary evidence. It is true that the Spanish were seen as powerful with their ships, armors, cannons, and horses, but they were also understood to be mortals. Interpreting Cortez as the return of Quetzalcoatl was something that developed decades later. The early Spanish clergy found Christian parallels all through the tales of Quetzalcoatl. Not only this god, but others as well, but not quite to the extent of Quetzalcoatl. As the centuries have passed, our popular conceptions of this deity have replaced the native interpretation of their own god. A clear reading of the stories of Quetzalcoatl leaves no room for the popular interpretation that have replaced the native views. The Christianization of Quetzalcoatl can help caution us against our own lack of sophistication in the relation to pre-Columbian legends and artifacts. So, how does Mormonism fit into all of this? It isn't uncommon to run into members who believe that the ancient Mesoamerican civilizations are related to the characters described in the Book of Mormon. Because the narrative of the Book of Mormon takes place somewhere in the Americas, it is tempting for Mormons to try to connect these civilizations with Book of Mormon events. I often ran into people on my mission who had recreations of ancient American artifacts and would claim that they portrayed Book of Mormon events. I remember hearing in church settings that Quetzalcoatl was a corrupted form of Jesus. The Book of Mormon, after all, describes a visit of the resurrected Jesus. It's also not difficult to find purported tours of Book of Mormon lands. I found several for 2024 alone. Tour guides will take you around to ancient ruins and claim that they were left by ancient Book of Mormon people. Also, church leaders would make claims that these stories reflected Book of Mormon people. The third president of the church, John Taylor, even believed that Quetzalcoatl was Jesus. He wrote, quote, "The story of the life of the Mexican divinity Quetzalcoatl closely resembles that of the Savior. So closely indeed that we can come to no other conclusion that Quetzalcoatl and Christ are the same being." This belief has been shared over the years, and there are many Mormons that have believed it. Granted, it is not all Mormons that believe this claim. And I have to admit, at one point, I found it compelling. However, it was because I took the people at their word when they would say that Quetzalcoatl was Jesus. Why would I doubt it? But when I would go try to find more information about it, because I found it so compelling, I would always come up with nothing. Or if anything, the evidence would come only from Mormon sources, and not something like the Smithsonian or National Geographic. I remember trying to line up the Olmec, Toltec, Aztec, and Mayan empires up to the Book of Mormon timeline, and they would never fit. And that is the thing about a lot of Mormon truth claims. In a vacuum, they seem very compelling. People will speak very authoritatively and provide partial evidence, usually snippets of stories that are taken out of context to bolster the claim. But when one dives deeper, you quickly realize that there is no support for the parallels. Mormons will do the same thing that the Spanish invaders did. They will shape some of these native stories to fit their worldview. There is no physical evidence of the Book of Mormon people, so it behooves believing members to try to shoehorn the Book of Mormon timelines into real civilizations. There is motivated reasoning that compels a believing member to try to shape native myths into Book of Mormon times. It is easy to see what you want to see and reject what doesn't fit. That is why I told some of the stories of Quetzalcoatl at the very beginning of this video. It's easy to see when you delve into the myths themselves that they bear no resemblance to Christianity or even to Judaism. Even the church's apologetic site, Fair Latter-day Saints, dismisses the parallels between Quetzalcoatl and Jesus. They call out that the people who try to draw this conclusion are not drawing on the original sources of the Quetzalcoatl myths, but on secondary sources. Sources that came via the Spanish, who had a vested interest in changing the myths to meet their purposes. They had an interest in seeing Christian parallels in American myths. Fair ultimately concludes that, quote, "When the original sources are studied, it becomes clear that the Christian parallels to Quetzalcoatl are not as significant as some previous authors have previously thought, unquote. So, there you have it. My analysis of the claims that the stories of Quetzalcoatl reflect the stories of Jesus. Did you find the Quetzalcoatl Jesus link compelling at any time? How about you, Barton, if you were watching? Do you still think I'm a lazy learner? Now look, I didn't really take offense when you said that I just wanted an excuse to sin. I have to admit, this is the first time someone has actually said this to me. But let me tell you, I take my sinning very seriously. I am very methodical and deliberate about how I sin. I drink coffee because it is delicious to the taste and very desirable. I occasionally drink alcohol because it is a nice social experience. It helps draw people together. I deny the existence of the Mormon type of God because it either doesn't matter because it doesn't exist, or because any being who would punish me for doing that without evidence really isn't worthy of my worship. But if you say that I am a lazy learner and purposefully obtuse, I do have to kind of take offense to that. There is a lot that I cannot put into my videos because they are long enough as it is. And if you have made it this far, congratulations. One of my core values is being curious and examining everything I can. Somewhat like Tyrion Lannister. I drink coffee and I know things. So call me a sinner if you wish. Tell me that your monster of a God is going to condemn me to an eternity of suffering because it doesn't have the emotional maturity enough to let a lesser being's words roll off its back. But please, don't call me a lazy learner. What are your thoughts? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like what I do, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next video.